Breach of Faith miniseries.
Part 1, The Levees. From her upstairs rooms, Peters could see the trees toss mercilessly in the wind, and she could hear the bits of shingling begin to shred and fly against the walls of the house with force that she knew would soon shatter the glass. And then, suddenly, the house shook with a concussive thud so violent that it knocked Kia back onto the bed and sent her mother scrambling to pull everything out of the closet so there would be room to shut themselves inside. In the months to come, many theories would be advanced as to exactly what sequence of events, what chain of natural forces and human failings, led to catastrophe in New Orleans, but to her dying day, Peters, like many of her neighbors, would remain convinced that the thudding sound, a recurring motif in her dreams, was the sound of the industrial canal being deliberately dynamited. Why? To spare the fancier, whiter, upriver parts of New Orleans from the devastation that would have gone their way if the flood walls had ruptured on the other side of the canal. One, two, three, boom! Everyone the same. Help! Help! Everyone has a right to their opinion, Peters would say when confronted with differing views about the explosive sound she heard as Katrina struck, that it was an electrical transformer blowing up, or, more probably, the impact of a barge as it was swept over the walls of the ruptured industrial canal and thundered like a giant empty oil drum onto the street below the levee. Part 2, Bush. White and black, exhausted and hungry, the New Orleanians were still huddled in a shelter the day after the terrible hurricane when the president, a Texan, stood among them, turned a flashlight onto his face, and said he was there to help. The hurricane was Betsy. The president was Lyndon Johnson. 40 years later, the memory for those who had lived through it was sharpened on the stone of another Texan's presidential performance. As 30 billion gallons of water poured into New Orleans on the day after Katrina made landfall, Bush could be found in San Diego for VJ Day anniversary observances where he strummed on a gift guitar with country singer Mark Wills. The post-Katrina era was 3 days old before Bush cut short his Texas vacation and on Wednesday headed back to Washington. The photo op was not LBJ among the people. It was Bush in the clouds, peering out the window of Air Force One as it dipped over New Orleans to provide the commander-in-chief a glance at the worst disaster in American history. Mrs. Bush spoke up to say that, as the person who lives with him, she knew that her husband cares about people, an assertion of Bush family values that was undercut by the famously callous remark by the president's mother. Barbara Bush suggested that maybe losing one's home, all earthly possessions, and perhaps a relative or two was not necessarily such a bad thing, a cleansing experience for the great unwashed, if you will. So many of the people in this arena here, you know, were underprivileged anyway, Mrs. Bush offered as she toured the Astrodome, so this is working very well for them. This is working quite well for them.
Part 3, Hospital.
There were many things that were infuriating and uplifting and simply strange about riding out Katrina at Charity Hospital, downtown New Orleans, huge Depression-era monument to poor people's medicine. There was a look on the face of the profoundly aphasic patient, a man essentially incapable of speech, and the tears that fell silently from his eyes, and the way he shook his head when one of the doctors had led him over to a fifth-floor window so he could look out onto the flooded streets below. There was a huge migration of people through those streets and past the hospital doors, people in search of shelter, men and women wading in chest-deep water, little children pulled along in rubber tubs and on inflatable mattresses, a whole city of them washed out of their homes and heading for the Superdome a block or two away.
Why are we still here? We were supposed to be evacuated.
Part 4. Looting. Not that looting was limited to kids. Grown men were doing it. Men they knew and who knew them. They got to Rite Aid too late to see it, but someone said the first wave of looters had used one of the security guards' guns to blow the locks. Rite Aid was an effing bonanza. Hair gel, beauty products, and that stuff costs. The Pampers department was depleted in a trice. Lakeisha rifled through the packets of Snapshots waiting to be picked up and found some of her own ready to go. One of the neighborhood men did not leave until he found an item he had hawked some days earlier. In other words, everyone was doing it. From what Tania had heard or wanted to hear, the police were saying, go to it. It would come to no surprise to Tania or any of the rest of them to learn, as they later did, that police had not only condoned the looting, but had participated lustily in it, notably at the Garden District Walmart, where fellow looters and reporters watched in amazement as uniformed officers hauled off jewelry, electronics, DVDs, and other valuables.
Part 5. Media.
A day later, he found himself on another elevated roadway, Causeway Boulevard this time, where it rose up over Interstate 10 in Jefferson Parish. Ambulances were dropping off medevac cases there, and as Jackson and a cluster of TV camera crews stood by, a helicopter clattered into position to pick up a woman with a broken hip. EMTs hopped out, snapped the gurney into its upright position, and began trying to ease the woman onto it. There seemed to be a problem with the gurney. The wheels wouldn't lock, and so every time the EMTs got ready to hoist her abroad, the damn thing would begin to rattle away from where it needed to be. "Can someone help us?" the EMTs were hollering at anyone within earshot. A moment of crisis, a touch of excitement. And so, the TV crews did what TV crews do, which is not to play EMT, but to zoom in on the woman's face, contoured with agony. Jackson had photographed wars in Iraq, in Bosnia. He had photographed death and dying. But the choice that confronted him, whether to chronicle the event or break right through the frame and take action, had never been so vexing, only in part because this disaster had hit so close to home. Maybe if he had been alone with his thoughts, he would have acted differently. But somehow, seeing the ethical challenge play out in the automatic responses of the camera crew made it harder to ignore. Jackson put down his cameras, great shot or not. He picked the woman up and helped him ease her onto the gurney, and that was when the impulse overcame him to just chuck a 30-year career and $10,000 in camera gear and start walking. It didn't matter where. My honest-to-God thought was just to walk down the interstate and go home.
Can we have some help here?
Part 6. End.
Amid the rubble, Kia found some clothing and her diplomas. She also found her mildewed, leather-bound copy of the National Dean's List for 2001 to 2002 and leafed through it until she found her entry, Dakia Johnson, Southern University at New Orleans. Her mother spotted a coffee can in which she had stored loose change and small bills, $200 at last count. But when she grabbed the can, the rusted bottom fell out and coins rained down and skittered into the cracks in the splintered wood flooring. She salvaged about $100. There was one last item she dreamed of plucking from the rubble that day, something worth more to her than all the rest, a framed poster. It showed a bucolic strip of small white wooden houses and a church facing a grassy expanse. A little girl, African American, walked in the grass in her Sunday best. Peters found the poster, so caked with mold and sludge she could barely make out the inscription. Fazen DeVille, 1867 to 1964. Anger and grief, a longing for what had been lost, and disgust with the world that had let it happen. Katrina Peters found herself pinioned between opposite emotions of ferocious intensity. All right, she was one of the lucky ones. She had survived. She had financial resources, the disability and Social Security checks that saw her and her parents through each month. Those assets were transportable to another town, and, in reserve, they had found a bland upriver existence. More than any of that, she had her faith. She missed the buzz of the big city, the bus rides downtown, a stroll through the quarter on a Saturday night. What she missed more was her church, Battleground Baptist, those joyful, song-filled services, the community of believers who had lingered on the steps, catching up with one another in the Louisiana sunshine. That was worth coming back for. That was life itself. And then it struck her. There was no Battleground Baptist. Yes, the maroon brick building still stood there. But Katrina had shredded and scattered its congregation like a Mardi Gras Indian tearing apart last year's costume before setting to work on a new one.